Well, thank you everyone for joining the Education Writers Association for this webinar on reporting remotely, strategies for sourcing from home. I'm Lori Couch, EWA's Assistant Director. Before we begin, let me go over some housekeeping items. If you have a question for our speakers, please type it into the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. Be sure to include your name and affiliation when you ask your question. And please ask your question at any time and we'll get to it during the Q&A toward the end of the webinar. With that, let me introduce today's moderator. I'm thrilled to have Lynette Clemetson, Director of the Wallace House and the Knight-Wallace Fellowships for Journalists at the University of Michigan. Thanks, Lynette, and take it away.
Thanks, Lori. Thank you for having me, and thank everyone for joining us today. And a special thanks to the reporters who are joining us to talk about a subject that everyone is thinking about and struggling with daily. Sourcing our beats, our stories is difficult and time consuming in the best of times, and the situation that we're in now presents unique challenges for reporters. And so we have two people who are thinking about this in smart ways and executing well to talk with us about how we handle remote sourcing in this time of this crisis. We have with us Biancas, who covers education and equality for the Boston Globe on their investigative education team. Bianca previously covered education for WGBH, and she was a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT in 2015. Hi, Bianca.
Hi.
And also joining us is Bina Raghavendran. Bina is the engagement reporter for the local reporting network at ProPublica. She works with several reporters around the country to boost audience voice and engagement in stories. She previously worked as an education reporter for the Star Tribune in Minneapolis. Hi, Bina.
Hello.
So, Bianca, I think we're going to start with you. When this crisis started, you had a great story that came out where you captured for everyone, I think, the difficulty of pivoting very quickly to a remote learning environment, and you profiled the school day of a 12-year-old named Maliki Soto. And Maliki was this wonderful kid who loved being in school, a very in-person learner, someone who liked asking questions. And suddenly he was thrust into this situation of being remote and having to try to navigate his school day in a crowded house and on devices. Can you talk about what led you to Maliki for the story?
So, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about the story because it was really fulfilling to do this story. The day that schools closed down, a couple of other reporters and I went out to bus stops and food distribution sites to see what was happening. We were curious about whether, some kids didn't get the message that school was canceled. We also wanted to see what kids and families were saying as they searched for food and laptops and other information. And Maliki was at one of those food sites, and he was wearing his uniform, and he was alone, and he was so charming and just told me that he was wearing his uniform because he wanted to feel like he was in school. So it was just really clear that, this was a kid who knew what he needed. And we wrote about him that day and decided to follow him later and see if he was going to get what he needed through this remote learning, get the type of structure and routine that he craved.
And so you found your story subject, a great story subject, and I feel like we really got to know him as a person in the story, so that's a credit to your reporting and writing. But you decided to follow him using Zoom and to observe his school day, since you couldn't be in a classroom with him or at his home, through his devices. How did you decide on that, and how did it work technically?
So I wanted to go to his house, and his family was okay with that. But then his sister came down with a fever, and they didn't know what it was. So we decided that I would follow him over Zoom over the course of a real school day from 9 to 2. And I proposed Zoom, even though I hadn't used it that much at that point. And he, what I didn't know at the time was that he was setting it up on a second computer, and he was doing his work on, on his primary computer. And so I would just watch him through the computer, read on the couch, type on his computer, ignore lots of distractions in his house. I asked him to give me a tour of his house, which was useful, and introduce me to people. But it wasn't a great tool for asking questions. And it was a little frustrating because I couldn't see the things that were out of the frame.
Right.
So
and how many hours did you observe him? What was the time period?
It was on and off. I had to jump off, and he had to jump off a couple of times, but it was on and off from 9 to 2, 9 to 1. Sorry, 9 to 1.
So replicating his study day.
Right.
Yeah. And what did you learn? So you managed to get through the story. What are some of the things you learned about using a tool like Zoom for reporting its limitations, its benefits, and how have you adapted that since then?
I think that it is useful for observing, right? I mean, it was incredibly useful to see what his apartment looked like and how people were using the space, and how he, studied in the living room while, people came and went. It was useful to see his spirits rise when he would get a ping from a teacher saying that they were going to have an in-person meeting. It was useful for those things, but it wasn't that useful to have like an intimate conversation with him. I tried doing a Zoom meeting with him the next day and just didn't get very much. So I started calling him, which was tricky because I didn't have his number. I only had his mom's number. They were protective about giving me his number. So I would call his mom and, set up a time to talk to him. And and I've noticed this with other young people as well. Another teenager I tried to interview over Zoom, she, just kind of turned the video off without just unceremoniously turned it off while we were talking. And I just think that it's hard for people to talk openly, through this type of video technology.
And I think, is it also hard because, in a lot of times the way you're getting good information out of a younger story subject is that you're able to talk to them away from their parent, and you're able to talk to the parent away from the child. And so they each feel more comfortable opening up. In this story, you did not have that. The child and the mother were right there all the time. And so how did you navigate that? And siblings.
That's right. And it was clear that the mom didn't really want the cracks to show in their home. She was sort of quickly losing control of their schedules, their sleep schedules. The kids were all going to bed much later than they usually did, and waking up much later, and she was getting frustrated, but she didn't really want these things to show initially. So yeah, it was hard because I also didn't know sometimes if his mom was in the room, and I didn't know if that was influencing how he answered questions. But over time, and I have to think that it had to do with being on the phone and not, in the video, and maybe his mom was not in the room, that he opened up and he was able to tell me things about being frustrated that he couldn't communicate with his teachers, or that he stopped having motivation. And I think it was just much easier to develop a rapport. But it was hard because I didn't know exactly who was in the room with him all the time.
Yes, I think I'm going to use this opportunity to bring Bina into the conversation. Bina, you work on engagement full time, and when we're thinking about sourcing our stories, and we want to be paying attention not just to the story, the basic story itself, but thinking about things like diversity in our sourcing and including a wide range of voices and experiences, and reaching out to communities who may be overlooked in the regular run and rush of reporting. And that kind of engagement and cultivation and trust takes time in normal circumstances. And people who might feel vulnerable in a sort of typical school environment, that vulnerability is heightened in a crisis like this. And as Bianca said so well, families not wanting the figurative cracks to show in their lives and the chaotic nature of the situation we're all in. Journalists are having to manage all of that now. And that's something in your job at ProPublica with the local news network, that you've been managing that kind of outreach and using digital spaces to reach people and communities for a long time. So can you jump in and tell us how you approach engagement with communities, especially communities who may feel vulnerable and may lack trust in reporters?
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to echo Bianca. Thank you so much to EWA for having us. It's really good to be able to talk about these important issues. So as Lynette said, at ProPublica, we have had a crowdsourcing team for several years now. And the way that we look at some of the crowdsourcing and crowdsourced reporting that we do is we really think about giving community members avenues to participate in the reporting that we do before the reporting even starts, during the reporting, like as we're publishing stories, and then after the story has been published. And so you can sort of think of it as like a cycle where you're keeping the community involved and sort of at the center of your reporting throughout the process. And our work during COVID actually hasn't been so like holistically different from the way that we have approached our engagement for years at ProPublica. At the end of February, we launched a questionnaire, which is what we do for several stories. So this screenshot just sort of shows like this is our typical questionnaire format where we'll ask people sort of what their connection is to an issue, and then based on what they select as their connection, the rest of the questionnaire sort of gives them a track of questions that is specific. So in this case, we have different questions for people who are working on the front lines as medical providers compared to people who might be working in a lab or people who are working in the pharmaceutical industry. And so we launched this questionnaire at the end of February when obviously COVID was a developing story here and around the country or around the world. And since then, and in combination with the questionnaire, we also have email addresses we've opened up. We opened up like a Signal and WhatsApp line telling people that they could contact us that way. And all told, we've now received more than 8,000 tips about the coronavirus just using these online tools. But Lynette, I mean, your question is talking more specifically about vulnerable communities, and that's something that we definitely do think a lot about. We try to see what we're getting through these avenues, and then we also try to see, who we might be missing, and that takes a lot of additional outreach. In this case, it's taken a lot of us reaching out to some of the providers who are talking to us and going back to them and saying, okay, well, what are some of the other social services agencies that you interact with? Or if you're writing into us about a food bank, that's great. Who else in your community's network should we be talking to? So I would say, we're approaching it similar to the way that Bianca and the ed team at the Globe did, really thinking about who those organizations are that are really meeting people where they're at, especially meeting some more vulnerable communities where they're at right now, and trying to plug into those places. But what was really helpful for us with doing this questionnaire is we're able to have our entire ask in one link. And if you go to propublica.org/coronavirus, you can see what the post looks like, but essentially, it's a post that sort of explains who we are, what our reporters are looking into, and then it goes into the questionnaire. And the great thing about having everything in one kind of succinct place is that makes it really easy for us to then do the outreach. And also, since it's a really easy URL, it's easy to call out on TV or on the radio, propublica.org/coronavirus, and people can just go and navigate to that link. So those are some of the ways that we're trying to keep the avenues open.
And I know you have more tips. If we can take a look at the next slide. So this is sort of your thought process for your feedback loop, right? And how you're moving from the reporter's idea, connecting that with the tips, and then back into the flow of stories, right?
Right, yeah, and our coronavirus reporting actually has taken this very path many times. Since we opened up the questionnaire so early, we got early tips that directly fueled some of our reporting in March, when I know every organization was starting to cover the coronavirus. And because we had sources who told us something that fueled a story, then we were able to go back to those sources, report back to them with our findings, and then go back with even more specific questions that we were trying to seed for a future story. And then we were able to tell the future story. And then in the course of that too, when we were sending feedback and the stories back to our sources, then they also sort of have the incentive to share that and spread that within their network. And so I do think that it was because of this engagement framework that we were also able to just keep doing this reporting and doing sort of the volume of reporting that was fueled by the tips.
Can we take a look at the next slide?
So this is, yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, this is kind of my first tip. Really solidify what your ask is for your community. Really think about who the people are that you are trying to reach. In this case, it could be educators and parents, and maybe you even have some questions for students. And think specifically about what your questions are for each of those groups of people. And then get really specific. Think about, what future stories you have on your plate, like what would actually help you tell that story. Because we found it's really helpful when we can go to our community and say to them, help us help tell these stories, that a lot of people do want to help and participate and be helpful to sort of fueling the reporting. And so then once you have your ask, figure out how you want to ask it. It could be as involved as a questionnaire. It could be something as simple as a social media post, like a tweet, or a tagline in italics at the bottom of your story where you're just asking a couple of questions. And then that becomes sort of the body of your ask, and that's the thing that you can sort of distribute and spread out.
Great. And I think there's one more slide here.
Yeah. Don't stop. It's great if you're putting this in as a tagline to your stories, but do remember that potentially your news organization's audience is going to be great, but there's always that next level that you can take this kind of outreach. And especially if we're thinking about whose voices we might be missing in our COVID education coverage, it can be helpful to sort of think about taking it to the next level, whether it is engaging at food distribution centers like Biancas did, or finding social services providers and caseworkers and asking them to sort of spread the word to families that they work with. I think all of those, sort of going the next level do help us hopefully tell some more complete stories.
And I know Bianca had a slide too. It's interesting that the food distribution center, where people are going for services, becomes a good link to a starting point for outreach. And I think that there's a slide with some tips from Bianca. Bianca, if we could have you jump back in.
They're pretty simple, pretty straightforward. It makes me realize I should be going back to these food sites all the time now. I've been using teachers and caseworkers and old sources and new sources to find families now, but I should be going out regularly back to these food sites. because I think that there are more people accessing them now than there were in the beginning. Again, yes.
Go ahead.
And then my other one is use Zoom to observe and do your interviews by phone, or I've been doing interviews in person still. Usually I meet people outside their homes with masks on, and for the most part, people have been, quite comfortable with that. So.
And I wonder, this is a question for both of you, but I'll ask Bianca to answer it first. Is this reporting slightly different than other stories in that you're experiencing the same chaotic change of life that your story subjects are experiencing, and are you approaching your reporting in a different way, maybe revealing more about your adaptive process, the way your life is changing, your life as a parent? You're also working and adapting to having a child at home. Does it change your closeness to the story, your closeness to the subjects?
It does, definitely. I'm sharing a lot more than I usually do. I'm showing my cracks in a way that I don't typically. I ask people, like Malachi's mother, certainly knew that I had a small child, and I was like, how do you do this? How do you do this with 4-5 kids at home? I'm really struggling. So there are few things that I've ever covered where I have been as affected by, the same crisis that is affecting other people. And I've covered, I've covered hurricanes, I've covered tornadoes, I've covered lots of other disasters, but this is the one that's been most universal.
Yes, and Bina, when you think about working with a network of reporters on this, and on the one hand, the number of tips that you said you've received is impressive. It also must be incredibly intense. And how do you manage the flow of hearing in very intense stories from people who are struggling in very real time at a time when the reporters are also going through the same thing?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it's definitely something I wanted to also make sure the attendees of this webinar could be aware of, because I'm definitely here to advocate for crowdsourcing, and I think it's a really great tool, especially right now when it might be difficult to get public records requests satisfied in a timely manner, whether that's bogus or not, or it might be really tough to get data. That's often where sort of crowdsourcing and hearing from the people can help us tell really strong stories. But I definitely want you all to be aware of that too. I mean, we are a team that reads hundreds of tips every year, and my team has covered, we've read stories about maternal mortality. We've read stories about hate crimes in the US. We did a story on PTSD and first responders, and heard first responders telling us about their really bad calls. And so we are used to sort of reading traumatic stories, but these hit really differently, and they were really, really painful and heartbreaking to read. And I think part of it was because it was such a real-time breaking news event. Part of it is because just the level of hopelessness in some of the responses that we were reading was just really striking, and it really affected our team. And so we actually did a few of us did a joint Twitter thread on this, I want to say last week, where we were just talking openly about, our team really struggled to read these hundreds and thousands of tips. And that is something I want folks to be aware of. But the way we kind of triaged it in our newsroom is we say that no one is alone in reading these tips. If you're the engagement reporter on call reading through the questionnaire and you come across something that's really startling, whether it's someone who might need National Suicide Prevention Hotline number or might need some other resources, we work in tandem with an editor. There's always an editor that we can just flag that tip to, send that tip over to. And then there are cases where we have followed up pretty quickly with some resources to the person who's writing in. And then we're also, you know, trying to take care of ourselves, like not read. Sometimes it helps to not read more than like 10 tips or, you know, 10 long stories that have come in at a time. We're trying to keep on top of like the DART Center's really excellent training and other really good resources out there for journalists that are just kind of dealing with the influx of things. But I think that that's a really important point to remember if you're jumping into doing any kind of crowdsourcing.
Yes, and Bianca, is there, have you faced any situations in your reporting where, because people are responding emotionally in a time of crisis, people are sharing with you because they're in a period of desperation, and you're having to do additional kind of screening about what's appropriate to report on, or how you deal with a source, or where you call in an editor for some guidance? Are those situations that are popping up for you?
I wouldn't say that these were situations where people were necessarily in crisis, but there have been some situations of, you know, coming across individuals who are so cut off from information, and are just completely, you know, out of the loop. I mean, their phones are cut off, they don't have internet, they don't speak English. I mean, who are really struggling and don't have anyone to, and have few people to help them, and aren't getting a lot of help. And there have been situations like that I've had to assess, and I've needed help assessing. And really kind of understanding the situation.
Where the line is, I guess.
Yeah, and understanding where, you know, the conditions and what led to the circumstances. But I think that I've come across a number of people who because school was one of their main connections to lots of different services and information, and that's disappeared, and they're having a hard time getting any kind of help.
I want to make sure we make time for questions from the people attending. And so, Lori, if you've had any questions from our audience that we can weave in, that would be great.
Certainly. Our first question is from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, from Jackie Hendry, education and health reporter for the South Dakota Public Broadcasting. She asks, what are some ideas for building those relationships when people have been encouraged not to talk to the press? An example she gives that's not education is the Smithfield plant employees. But teachers are certainly a group of people who have been encouraged not to talk to the press. And I think, Bianca, you've run into this situation. So we'd love to hear your advice.
I think that, you know, when people are, I mean, these are different times, right? These are different situations than what we're used to. And I think that there are conditions now of health and safety that are causing some people who normally wouldn't have talked to talk. And that's true for some teachers who, you know, in the districts that we cover, who are seeing, administrative changes that are being made in their schools now, sort of because under the cover of this virus. And, so I guess I would question whether people really, whether things are the same, whether the situation is really the same as it usually is. Because I think that people have more at stake now.
But I guess to the questioner's point, from the point of view of administrators, you mentioned earlier, Malachi's mom not wanting the cracks to show in their family.
Yep.
And certainly in school districts, this crisis has laid bare where all the cracks are. Who has devices, who doesn't, who has contact with the families in their district and who doesn't, which kids are so close to falling through the cracks that they just fall through completely in a situation like this. And it is, all of the cracks are showing. And so are you, how do you deal with people who want to tightly control the flow of information?
Well, it's a little harder. In some ways, it's harder for the schools to control that information now, right? Because everyone is at home. Kids are at home, and families are at home. So in some ways, it's harder for them to do that. And then I also found that some teachers are also really eager to stand up for themselves right now too, right? Because in Massachusetts, for example, there's a lot of public discontent about how remote learning is going. So I think some teachers also want to stand up for themselves and be proactive about talking. So I've had mixed reactions from teachers during this time. Some have, wanted to get permission to talk to me. Some have just talked to me pretty openly about how remote learning is going and how they're frustrated with the guidance that they've gotten from the district. I've been pleasantly surprised by the teachers who have spoken out, but here, at least in Boston, usually, it's the teachers who are closer to retirement, who are the union reps at their schools. I've basically used other teachers to crowdsource those folks.
Right. Yes. Lori, do we have another question?
Yes, for Bianca. Were the families you talked to at the food distribution sites hesitant to reply, especially if it was their first time to seek assistance?
No, I found that people were really pretty open that first day because, at that point some people were already laid off, but there were also a lot of the shelves were bare, right, in stores. So there wasn't a lot of shame in picking up food because there was a sort of a shared sense of insecurity about whether there would be food on the shelves in stores. So it wasn't just about not having money at home to buy things. It was also because you just couldn't be sure that when you went to the store, you were going to find bread. And people were also there to pick up computers at that time. But no, I didn't find that anyone was really very shy about talking.
And the next question is about interviewing a minor. From Peggy Barmore of a freelancer and a reporter at the Hechinger Report. Did school officials allow you to ask Malachi questions on school property? And what about privacy considerations for these students? Did you ask for permission from any adult to interview them?
So I got permission. So I approached him outside his home, outside the school, and asked him if I could go talk to his mom. They lived across the street. And so I asked his mom. She came downstairs and I said, I noticed your son was wearing his uniform. And I was asking him about going to, the food site. Do you mind if I ask him some more questions? So in this case, it was really fortunate that, it was apparent that he would be a good person to talk to, and his family lived across the street. Because it was, I asked him, I think early on, how old are you? What grade are you in? And he was 12. And we have a policy that we won't interview, I think it's kids under 14 without, without parental consent. I think that's the policy.
Yeah.
So it was easy to get consent quickly there. But no, I didn't. Yeah.
Can I ask Bina to answer a version of this question too? When you're getting tips from your crowdsourcing, is it clear to you? Is there a question on that questionnaire about the age of the person offering the tip, and if the age is below a certain threshold, do you reach out and ask for an adult? How do you manage consent in a crowdsourcing environment?
So one thing that we do on our questionnaires is we have like a privacy disclaimer at the top that says anything that you submit to us is going to be used for background purposes for our reporting. Like, you're not just going to submit something and then see it in print tomorrow, which I think is probably contributes to the reason that we are getting so many responses, because people feel that they can trust us to just kind of unload whatever they want to share about the coronavirus in that moment. And that has included a handful of students, and some, not very many of them, but a couple of them have been really young. And the only reason we can tell that is because we have a button that says, are you a student? Do you attend a school or a university? And so then people are checking that, and then they're coming down and explaining a bit more about their school situation. And so we can start to understand what grade somebody is in. But again, that's not the majority of people, I would say. We have very few who are younger respondents. And in that case, I think we would always just make sure that we had parental consent if anyone is younger than 18, though we haven't encountered that situation yet where we're sourcing directly from a young person who has written in. But we do, especially with the questionnaire, we do try to be really clear with our sources about what the expectations are when they're filling something out. And so if we are even considering publishing anything from them, we will follow up and give them kind of a clear outline of where they can expect that their response is going to go.
Most of our conversation up to this point has been about how we use technology and devices to reach out to people when we can't do in-person sourcing. And but Bianca, you also mentioned that one of the things that you're finding in your reporting is parts of the population that are just completely cut off from information. And so we're talking about how to use technology, but what about families who are cut off? And whether that's in a rural community or in an area in a city where there just isn't a flow of communication, or there's a language barrier, how should reporters be thinking about reaching out when personal contact is not an option and technology is a difficult option? Bianca, I'll put that to you first.
How should we think about? I haven't. So far, I've had the problem of I've come across students who, you know, don't have internet at home, but they have had some kind of data plan that's still working on a phone, and so they might come and go. And I think I've had to learn not to read too much into a lack of response. It might be that their phone was turned off when I text them. And so I might try calling and then I hear, oh yes, their phone has been turned off, and then it might be turned on again in the next, next month. I've had to find creative ways to communicate with people. You know, I have one source that I'm only communicating with on Facebook because he doesn't have a phone anymore, but he does still have internet, but his phone doesn't work, it died. So I've just had to find creative ways to pester people, and also not to assume that people are ghosting you. It might be that their phone was turned off, or it might be they've just lost access. But I am trying to think of creative, like the same person who is only communicating through Facebook. I mean, I've wondered, you know, would it freak him out if I just showed up at his house sometime? Because we can't really make those arrangements anymore.
Yes.
We can't, it's hard to make an appointment now with him. So if I showed up, is his family gonna, flip out? We know they're home. So, yeah, it opens up a new sort of range of questions about communication for sure.
And Bina, how is that sort of inequality in access to both technology and connectivity? How is that showing up in your work as an engagement reporter?
Yeah, so these were things that we were thinking about pre-COVID, and they have, I think, just only become more relevant during the pandemic. At ProPublica, we have tried a few different offline crowdsourcing strategies. Last year, we sent a couple hundred handwritten letters to people in Memphis who had been sued by a couple of companies in the area because we were trying to reach people to see if they could sort of tell us their stories and what that experience had been like. In addition, we've also done quite a bit of flyering in public housing complexes that we also did late last year, and then actually earlier this year, the weekend before COVID hit, we were doing some more of this in-person flyering, which I'm glad we did because it was sort of our last weekend we could have done it in person. So yeah, we've also had success rolling up flyers and putting them in door handles at public housing complexes, and that being a way that people will then know that we're investigating or reporting, and they can call back and get in touch with us. Obviously, with COVID, that changes, and with social distancing, it may not make the most sense for you to go door to door and stick flyers in everybody's doors. But I do still think that some of these offline methods, whether it's setting up a text messaging bot or some sort of thing where you can send mass text messages, or whether it's if you're in a situation where everybody's address, writing letters, because as Bianca said, I do think it's sort of an opportunity that we are in a time where everybody is at home, and we do have a large chunk of the education community that is going to be online for most of that day too, which is probably, it presents kind of a neat opportunity for ed reporters who previously couldn't reach teachers for a large chunk of an 8-hour day. So I do think that is an opportunity, but I also do think it's an opportunity for our communities that might not be online, because we know that they're going to be at home too. So really thinking about, is there can I send everybody a letter? Can I flyer in a particular community, or drop off a stack of flyers at a grocery store that I know people are going to be going to? I think sort of thinking outside of the box and really thinking about where your community is and what they might still be accessing could help you come up with some other ways to plug in there.
Great. Lori, I want to check in with you to see if we have other questions.
We do. First is from Neil Morton of the Hechinger Report. Are there any examples of outlets you think have done a good job with engagement and crowdsourcing over the past couple of months?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. I think that some of the pieces that have really stuck with me, I know like the New York Times did a really neat story. I don't know when it was. It might have been a couple of days ago, where they were in Queens and they went like door to door in a particular neighborhood, and it was a story about, you know, how people in the community are dealing with quarantine and what's one thing that they've learned from quarantine. But I really appreciated that it ended up looking like montages, because they did like actually go door to door and take a photographer with them, and all the photos were taken from a 6 feet distance. And you know, the questions were I think things that like people could, I really appreciated that they were questions that people could answer pretty easily and have like pretty thorough answers to. It was like, what's one thing you've learned in quarantine, or what's the thing that you're most excited about doing when the lockdown is over? And so sort of keeping it open-ended that way, I think allowed people to have some really powerful responses. So that was one story that I really enjoyed. I'll have to think of some others and curate a list.
How about you, Bianca or Lynette?
Bianca, has there been anything that stood out for you?
For crowdsourcing? Well, there was a survey on on the New York Times about the gender division in work at home. That certainly caught my attention. But yeah, I can't think of yeah, I have to pass on that one. There's nothing that comes immediately to mind.
You know, my example is not one that it doesn't reflect outward what a reader would have seen, but I just know the mechanics of it behind the scenes. And it's something that I thought about, Lori, when you were asking one of the earlier questions, and somebody raised, how do you get through to the workers at the meatpacking plant? One of our current Knight-Wallace Fellows, Elliot Woods, who's a narrative magazine writer, has been doing a series for Wired on healthcare workers, and he's focusing on hospitals here in Michigan. And when the crisis first started, to Bianca's point about, yes, there's this difficulty, but in some ways there's this opportunity, because people in certain professions are being vocal in a way that they're not normally being. When the communications apparatus at a particular hospital was not responding, I know that what Elliot did that I thought was very smart, he didn't immediately crowdsource. He started following doctors and nurses on social media and just following their conversations with one another and observing who he thought the influencers were in a particular hospital community, who people were responding to, so just doing in-depth observing in social communities and online to see who the people were in a community and who they responded to, and then very carefully reaching out to those people, because then they opened a door to everybody else. And it worked to very good effect for him. And I think just also really closely following people's communications within their network before ever entering made him an informed observer, so that when he finally did get to talk to someone, he really knew what their concerns were. He was able to jump right in at points in the conversation that he knew they were focused on. And so I thought that was a very smart use of kind of lack of access, and how you can build that up to your advantage.
Neil, I wanted to jump in with a couple other quick examples I pulled from our team Slack. There was one really good Brian Lehrer show, I believe it was earlier this week, where New Yorkers actually called in with 1-minute tributes to loved ones who have died due to COVID. And so I think that's like a really nice, definitely like devastating and heartbreaking, but nice example of sort of opening up the avenue for people to share. And another project I really appreciated was one that the Post must have done back in April, where they profiled some of the early coronavirus deaths and, you know, sort of wrote out little obituaries of the different people who had passed away. So I also thought that was a nice project, especially in a time where, you know, we're working to confirm cases and working to figure out sort of what all of this means. That brought some good meaning to it using crowdsourcing.
Lori, do we have any more questions? Oh, I can't hear you for some reason.
We do. First, the next one is on, hello, can you hear me? Nope.
Yeah.
Okay. You still can't hear me?
I can hear you now.
Let me see if I can go to phone call. Okay, great. From Amy French. What about teacher groups? You know, do you cruise teacher groups to see what they're saying online, and you know what they're saying when they let their hair down and they're not on record? I think we can also bring up, Bina, you talked about TikTok with me and kind of cruising that to see what teens are saying. Any insights into using that as a tool?
Yeah, sure. I went down the TikTok rabbit hole pretty early in COVID and found myself pretty late one night just scrolling through. So I don't even remember if it was a hashtag I searched or what it was that I searched, but ended up kind of finding some stories where kids were, you know, posting in school, but sort of posting in some of the last days of school even being open, and just kind of capturing in that moment sort of what the anxiety was like around this kind of virus that was sort of sweeping the country and not really knowing what that meant for them. So I thought that those were, you know, kind of cool to sort of just capture the sentiment of what was going on. But I would definitely encourage folks to take a look at TikTok just to understand, you know, what the youth quarantine sentiment is right now, and you know, and how that might play into remote learning. I would encourage you just to like download it on your phone and check it out and figure out like what you can discover that might be relevant to you. I can also see if there are any good TikTok reporting guides out there that I might be able to just post in the chat to see if that could help folks.
I'm glad you used the word rabbit hole though, Bina, because it is easy to just fall down TikTok and realize an hour later that you have just fallen in a well and need to pull yourself out. Yes. Well, I know, Lori, that we have to get ready to wrap up. One of the things I think I would like to say to everybody, and to Bina and Bianca, even though we started this conversation, you know, talking about adapting to a crisis, one of the things I really appreciate about both of your responses is that while certainly this has been a challenge, it has also presented opportunities for reporters. And in the same way that this is stretching into all areas of our lives, this need to rapidly adapt has shaken loose some old things that we thought were conventions that couldn't be broken, and everybody's learned how to move and work in a different way, and that the result of that is actually some very good reporting and good stories and good connections, and hopefully connections with communities that maybe reporters hadn't been in contact with before, connections to stories and issues that weren't visible before. And I know that I feel like I'm learning a lot, consuming. There's a lot of creativity that I'm seeing in people's reporting, and that has to be a good thing, not just for reporters and our personal growth, but also for the communities that we all serve. And so I really appreciate the energy that both of you are devoting to really thinking through how to go about doing your work and improving the way you approach your jobs, and being so nimble in this time. It's impressive.
Thanks.
Thank you. I wanted to add really quickly, we do have a substantial number of education-related tips in our coronavirus questionnaire. And so if any of the journalists on the call are interested in hearing what we have or trying to see if we might have something from your community, Rick dropped my email in the chat. Feel free to send me a note and I can check for you and see what we have and see if I could share any sources with you.
That's great.
Okay. Thank you so much, Lynette, for moderating this terrific webinar. And I want to thank Bina and Bianca as well for participating today. And I want to thank you all for joining us. As soon as the webinar closes, you'll see an evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is important to us, and it helps us improve. And finally, we want to encourage you to attend more webinars and hopefully in-person seminars sometime in the future. But thanks again for joining us today. And thank you guys again for such a terrific discussion. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.